My name is Sandy Tatum, and I'm here, I'm delighted to say, to talk about Sam Morse, one of the more remarkable people I have ever known in a life that I must say has been thoroughly remarkable. A little background on Sam. He went to Yale. He played football for Yale. And he came out to the West Coast, and he eventually hooked up with the Big Four, Huntington, Hopkins, Crocker, and Stanford. They had built a hotel called the Hotel Del Monte and a railroad line running to it, which was typical of the way a lot of railroads were developed in those days. And Sam was offered a job working on that particular project. In the course of working on it, he had a good reason to take a really very careful look at the 5,500 acres that the Big Four, in a place with an operation called, I think, the Pacific Improvement Company on the Monterey Peninsula, a piece of real estate, incredible piece of real estate that they owned. And Sam got very interested in it, so much so that he found a banker, a fellow named Herbert Fleischacker in San Francisco, who would put up the $1.5 million that it took to buy that 5,500 acres in those days, back in, I would think, about 1910 or 12. When he bought the property, the previous owners, the Big Four, had caused it to be subdivided with 80-foot lots running from where the 18th green at Pebble Beach presently is all the way around to the 10th green. And Sam, having acquired it, about 20 or 30 of those lots had been sold. But Sam, incredibly, as I will expand on in a minute, he made golf the linchpin of his whole development. Now we're talking about 1910, 12, 13, 15, when golf was hardly on anybody's radar screen, certainly not on developers' radar screens. And I also will indicate why it was so extraordinary that, particularly, that Sam Morse should have been focused on golf. But in any event, he was. And in order to realize that focus, he had to buy back those 20 lots, which he somehow managed to do, and therefore created the area in which the golf course at Pebble Beach was designed and built at Sam's direction, with two amateur golfers, one being Jack Neville, who had won the amateur championship with California, and the other being Douglas Grant, an Englishman, who had a great feeling for the game. And they made the original layout of Pebble Beach. And then Sam, along the way, participated personally in seeing Pebble Beach developed to the point where it became, and is today, certainly a golf mecca. And he also set aside one of the most interesting, beautiful pieces of the planet, the Cypress Point area, for a small membership private golf course, and therefore, in a sense, preserved an area that has beauty to this day that is so very, very, very impressive. He also created a golf course called the Monterey Peninsula Country Club and set that in among a real estate development, so that those were 3 golf courses that Sam developed. And then he came along some years later and developed another one called Spyglass Hill. And the reason why I find it so totally extraordinary that Sam Morse, of all people in those days, could have seen the potential for golf in the way in which he saw it, is that I played one round of golf with him. I avoided ever playing with him again, because notwithstanding all of the delightful characteristics that he had off the golf course, Sam had the worst combination of a terrible temper and a lousy golf game. And to illustrate the point, we were playing the 6th hole at Cypress Point. And as you will understand, I will never forget the experience. I had hit a pretty good drive down the middle. Sam hit his off the toe of the club and it went into the woods. Sam and the caddy disappeared into the woods. And from there on in, I was standing out in the middle of the fairway and balls were ricocheting off trees and noises were coming out of the woods. And finally, a ball hit a tree in the right way and came out onto the fairway. Sam, at that point, was virtually, well, yes, he was basically out of control with the temper. And he stood up to the next shot and he hit it. And it went up in the air and it came down in a loose piece of bark hanging off of a tree about 20 feet off the ground. With that, Sam took his club that he played the shot with, went up to the tree, began to hit the tree with the club, and said, "You goddamn son of a bitch tree, it is going to come down tomorrow." And I thought, oh, gee, Sam, I hope you'll rethink that. That tree's important. Happily, Sam cooled off enough so that the tree survived Sam's temper. But when you consider how quite extraordinary at any level his development of the area that is the Monterey Peninsula by using golf as a linchpin, when you consider his background and the fact that he was such a lousy golfer, it adds mystique for me to the whole story of how Pebble Beach and its environs got developed. And he for example, of what I find mystical, really, is that he preserved Cypress Point. He created a golf club there, and he developed it in the middle 20s. And in order to finance the development, they needed 200 members, each paying $2,500. When the Depression hit, they had only had 105 members, not nearly enough to carry the place. And Sam carried it. How he did it, I can't imagine, given all the other constraints that the terrible Depression imposed on the operation on the Monterey Peninsula, his operation. But he carried it through the Depression. And just to illustrate two things, one, how extraordinary that was, and the other, how desperately deep the Depression hit. Because after all, the members of the Cypress Point Club were at least fairly upscale economically. In 1938, the Cypress Point Club had 34 members. All of the rest of the members had dropped out on account of the money factor. Sam, in order to preserve that 34 members, he reduced the membership fees to $10 a month and gave them free access to Pebble Beach. And I think that single illustration tells you almost all you need to know with regard to two factors. One, how desperately deep was the Depression, and the other was how Sam Morse was somehow managed to keep Cypress Point alive. And in my view, he did it almost into the 50s until it became viable economically. And he did it in a context where the whole impact of the Depression on all of Sam's operations was, to put it mildly, very, very difficult to handle. But that was Sam. I think, in summary, Sam was a visionary, true visionary. And if anybody is interested, and I should certainly think there should be, what Sam's vision produced, just go out there today to the Monterey Peninsula and drive around it, and you'll see the evidence of Sam Morse's vision.